We like open source for a couple reasons. Primary being it's free, so there's really no reason not to deploy it. If you have the time to stand up the virtual machine and install it and get it configured, then it's about the lowest cost, lowest point of entry to getting in there that you can, with, of course, options for support. So if you'd like the tool, but you want somebody else to do all the work of hosting it, maintaining it, doing software updates, then each of these companies has a support model, right, Barrie?
Yep. And that's kind of what supports them and enables them to keep developing these. So it's important that they have that option for both themselves and us. So like for a Greenfield, it's obviously a lot easier because you decide how you're going to do this. You don't have to contend with the reality of what's in your network. So you come up with your network design, right, before you even start deploying things. So you can model that in your source of truth.
Hi there. Welcome, everybody, to today's NetMavens webinar. Thanks so much for joining. We have our guest here today. Joining us is Barrie Jones-Cook, and Barrie's been a contact and a colleague of mine for several years now. We've worked on a bunch of projects together, including a Nautobot deployment that we did together, and I'm super excited that she's here. She's going to help us go through a bunch of information about how to document your network using open source of truth tools. And so thank you for joining. If you're here, just give us a little shout in the chat. Let us know where you're coming in from. I see that we have a gentleman named Mike on. Mike's coming in from Phoenix. Thanks for joining the webinar today, Mike. And do we have anybody else? If you are, we got Greg from Phoenix as well.
Hi, Greg.
I have a feeling these are our old Global Crossing friends, Mike Hoyt and Greg Freeman. Thanks for coming on.
I actually grew up in Mesa, so very familiar with Phoenix.
Mike is also a NetMaven.
All right.
So we're going to be starting just with some basics. What is an open source SOT? These things are known by a lot of different names, not just source of truth. I had this conversation on my last webinar. One of my customers likes to just simply refer to this as the field of metadata. We always want metadata about anything that's in our network, a device, an interface. We want to know who the vendor is. We want to know what the role is. We want to know an interface description. We want to know who the provider is, where it's connected to. All of this really valuable information is called a whole bunch of things. But when we talk about the system, sometimes it's called a network model, a network data model, a source of truth. There's another term that gets thrown around called single source of truth, which is an adjacent term. Sometimes just called network documentation, sometimes it's called an inventory system. What else have you heard it called, Barrie?
Well, I've heard people refer to system of record as equivalent, and I'm not sure it actually is exactly equivalent, but people will use that sometimes too.
System of record's an important one too. People use that one as well as a substitute for source of truth. So there's a lot of options out there in the commercial world. I'll be honest, I don't particularly like any of the commercial options that are out there. I don't find that they work all that well, but there are choices that you can make. If you are currently using a commercial tool in your business, give us a 1 in chat. If you are currently using a totally in-house developed tool, do a 2. If you're using an open source SOT already, type in a 3. And if you don't have anything and you're thinking about which one to deploy, type a 2. And I guess another option, if you work for one of these vendors, type a 5, because I noticed we had a lot of registrants. We had registrants from all 3 of the people we're reviewing today, Netbox, Nautobot, and InfraHub, and the respective companies that are behind those, Netbox Labs, Network to Code, and OpsMill. We have registrants from all of those that, if they haven't joined, they could be joining soon.
Yeah, I don't think they've joined yet. We did get Tony join. He didn't say where he's from, but I know he's from South Africa. So probably is going to win the farthest attendee race, if there is one.
You win the prize for the highest latency, Tony, hailing from Johannesburg.
Greg says 2.
Yeah, so Greg's using that. 2 was for an in-house developed tool, which is not uncommon for large carriers. Sometimes they start with a third-party developed commercial tool, and it just never seems to quite scratch the itch, so they decide to develop something. Well, Barry and we've both worked on all 3 of the tools we're going to be reviewing today, and we like open source for a couple reasons. Primary being it's free, so there's really no reason not to deploy it. If you have the time to stand up the virtual machine and install it and get it configured, then it's about the lowest point of entry to getting in there that you can, with of course options for support. So if you'd like the tool, which there's no reason really to not like these tools, but you want somebody else to do all the work of hosting it, maintaining it, doing software updates, then each of these companies has a support model, right, Barry?
Yep. And that's kind of what supports them and enables them to keep developing these. So it's important that they have that option for both themselves and us.
Why is the source of truth important, Barry?
Well, if you would like to automate your network, you can start with just what's out there in your Brownfield environment, and you can configure things manually, but often people make mistakes. And everybody wants to document their network. I don't think I've come across a network that wants to document it, but they have a hard time doing so. So this enables you to document your network, allows you to, if you get to that point, limit CLI configuration, because that's where people make mistakes. So if you have a standard, you have certain NTP servers you want all your switches and routers to use, as a simple example, then you put them all in here. You can manage all of your devices from the source of truth and then push it all out. Then you don't have somebody putting a different NTP server on one switch and a different one on on the other switches. So you keep your network much more to standards, and then that keeps, hopefully, outages to a minimum.
Yeah. The issue with so many data sets is that inevitably they get out of sync with what the network actually has. And that poses something of a problem.
And
particularly
that can
when
happen. That can happen with a source of truth as well. The source of truth can be no longer the source of truth, but we're going to talk about how to help that.
Yeah, a reconciliation process is really valuable. But if you are using a visual documentation platform, if your network documentation says in Visio or the Lucid app, one of those kinds of things, there really isn't even the ability to synchronize. So, and certainly not automate off of that information, even though, and it requires you to go in and draw things and label things and do a bunch of work. Not very efficient compared to these platforms.
Another thing I've seen people use is spreadsheets, but those get out of date almost immediately. You put everything in the spreadsheet, and by the time you're done, it's out of date. So
absolutely,
it's really hard to synchronize.
Absolutely. We have a customer who they've been using Nautobot actually for a while, and they've been using it for IP. They're getting quite comfortable with it, but they're only just now getting around to taking all their patch panels and putting them into Nautobot. And up until now, they've used spreadsheets.
Yeah,
it's very common to use that. Same with IP address management. A lot of people start out using spreadsheets. My first IP address management tool was a text file with VO.
Well, yeah. As were many others, I'm sure.
It gets pretty unwieldy, but the IPAM features in these source of truth tools are very easy to use and API driven too, which is really helpful for automation, right, Barry?
Yep. Yeah. And so, I mean, you can see the typical features are the IPAM. Most of these will have IPAM. Most will have a way to do data center infrastructure management, or DSIM, which is basically documenting what's in racks, what's in switches, what's connected to interfaces, etc. So yeah, and like you said, the APIs are critical for being able to pull that information out in a programmatic fashion and access it on the fly in Python programs or whatever you're using, Nornir, Ansible, and so on for pushing configs to the devices themselves.
The DSIM capability is really IPAM's cool, but the DSIM is really the magic. That really is the model of everything.
Well, and they work together because when you assign an IP address to an interface in the DSIM, it's automatically entered in the IPAM in all of these. So, yeah.
So it automatically relates. If you have any questions about what is an open source of truth tool, or any comments you want to push back or make any other observations, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll circle back to those. We're going to keep moving on to the next slide here now and talk about these three platforms that we've selected today: Netbox, Nautobot, and InfraHub. So talk about, what's different between them, Barrie?
Well, Netbox has been around for, I would say, decades at this point. Maybe not 2 decades yet, but more than one. So it's the original one. So over the years, it evolved a lot. I used it a few years ago for the first time, and it was a custom version for the company that was using it, and that was very common back then. It has evolved since then. I think back then it was like 2.4, and now they're on at least 4.1. So a lot of stuff has happened since then, but they stay true to their original goal of being the best at documenting the network. And so they have not typically developed their own plugins in the sense of officially developing them to be part of the platform. They've allowed the community to do that and then have incorporated some as official plugins or certified them as time has gone on. Then Nautobot, they have the same root, Netbox and Nautobot. Nautobot was actually forked from Netbox a couple years ago, maybe I think 2021. So we're getting close to 4 years at this point. Because they had a vision, the people that were working on that part of it wanted to develop a full automation platform and not just be about documenting the network. They wanted to offer some database options as well. And so there was a decision made to just fork it. And it was pretty amicable. I think some of the fans were kind of up in arms about it, but the two companies themselves were very much like, hey, we're just going to continue on. We're going to develop 2 platforms here. So that's kind of the history there. And then InfraHub is fairly new. I think the founder was actually from Network to Code, who were the maintainers of Nautobot. And he had another vision, a new vision, and he wanted to build the platform from the ground up to incorporate a graph database with native version control and allow for more flexible schemas than the structured schemas that SQL requires. And so most of Nautobot and Netbox are all SQL based. And so yeah, they also had a couple of other things they wanted to include, like configuration artifacts, so that you don't have to generate configuration on the fly every time. And then you store that with the device that is generated for. So
you could summarize this by saying that Nautobot and Netbox are very, very similar, and in fact share the same original codes. The user interface is very similar.
Yeah.
But over the years since that fork has happened, they've diverged in terms of the plugins that are available for each. So later in the webinar, we'll discuss and give you some links. If you download just for registering, you'll get a copy of this deck. You'll be able to go and review the plugins that are available for each. There's a lot of them, so we can't really review all the plugins for all of the platforms in just an hour. There's like almost 100 across all 3 platforms that we'd have to look at. But the other thing that's interesting is the go-to-market between these 2 companies is a little bit different, right, Barrie? They cloud versions available, but the way they think about how they solve problems for customers is different too, right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not super familiar with what Netbox is doing most recently, but yeah, they definitely, I think Nautobot will go in and try to provide a whole holistic solution. I'm not sure how Netbox does that, but the goal is they support certain apps that allow Nautobot to be an automation platform. And then they have the concept of jobs as well. And so you can plug in, you can install, they call it an app now. They've changed from plugins to apps, but golden configuration, you can install that app, and then you have the ability to set up a job to back up configs, and then you can go from there to then compare that to a Jinja template generated config that's generated from the data in Nautobot and compare them, and then you can decide, oh, do I need to actually change the config on the switch, or do I need to change it in Nautobot? And then you can go from there to, once you're comfortable with that, you can move on to having it automated in the sense that whenever something changes in Nautobot, a job will push out the new config once you're comfortable that everything is in sync properly.
Yep. So InfraHub's really of the three, InfraHub's the most different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's because they just completely re-envisioned what the database is going to look like. And they went with a GraphQL database instead, and they went with a scripting language that would let you define the structures. That makes it unless you use one of their already built templates, it makes it a lot harder to get started. But it
they
also
do have a
lets
lot
you
of
do
templates, so it's not that hard.
But it also lets you do almost anything with InfraHub too. It lets you not just IP networks, but way better for trying to implement a transport network into InfraHub.
We hope. We haven't tried that yet, but the cool thing about it is the schemas are all just YAML files. So you can, if you have this dream to model a transport network, for example, in theory, you can go in there and you can change the modules as you see fit and make them relate to each other in a way that works for what you're trying to do. So in theory, anything is possible.
Yep. You just did a hackathon at the last NANOG.
That's right.
That was based on InfraHub, right? Tell us. And actually, Tony, who's on the webinar, was involved in that too, was he not?
Yeah. Tony and I are both on the hackathon committee. I created an InfraHub challenge for the past hackathon, and I thought it would not take as much time as it did, but it did. It took a lot of time, and but it was really fun because I really got to see, okay, I actually pulled in data. There's also a Nautobot challenge for the hackathon, and so I used InfraHub Sync to pull in the data that was in the Nautobot stand-up for the hackathon, and I pulled that into InfraHub so they had the same data. And then people wrote a GraphQL query to configure 4 interfaces, basically. And then they created a configuration artifact based upon that. So that was very simple, using a very simple network that was already modeled in Nautobot, but it really illustrated the differences between them and also the similarities. So,
well, speaking of similarities, let's move on to the next chart here, where we talk about, well, what do they all have in common with each other?
Yep. Yeah. So, we talked about DSIM before. So you can do data center infrastructure management in all of these. You can model locations, rack elevations, your devices, your circuits, your cable connections with varying levels of customization. So that sort of thing is built in to Netbox and Nautobot, but you can create your own device templates, and you can use custom fields for doing, if you have something kind of outside the basic format for a circuit or a cable connection that you want to do. And then, of course, in InfraHub, you can just, upload a basic schema. They have the basic schemas, like, here's what you probably want to start with if you're thinking of this the way you would use Nautobot and Netbox. So they have that for you. They have the base, I think they call it the base schema. And so, yeah, you don't have to come up with that on your own. They have a schema library and provide all that. And then if you go to their demo, you can see how they have it in a working instance of InfraHub as well. But yeah. And so then, of course,
do they all have that, good question, they all have that cable tracing capability? So once you've identified that, this cable goes to this customer circuit, connects to this patch panel backside connects to this router or switch, will they show you cable traces after you've done all that documentation?
You mean like in Nautobot, how they'll display it for you as a visual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am not sure if they do that. That might be something that could definitely be done. I'm sure that you can. I haven't seen a lot of that visualization. I haven't had the time to look into that. So I don't know about that in particular, but I'm sure you can put the cable connections in InfraHub and at least model them with data. And then how you use that, I think that remains to be seen. It's probably, I'm 99% sure it's possible.
Should have asked you that question during prep, so
Yep.
you could have done some research on that. My bad.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we've got some of the people from Ops Mill here, I don't think we do. I don't think I've seen them join.
No.
But maybe they can answer that. And, in upcoming slides, we're going to talk about how to get in touch with all three of these companies if you have questions, specific questions to what you're trying to do. So that's another possibility. But yeah, if for IPAM, they all have that in common as well. You can model or you can keep track of your RIRs that you're using, regional internet registries. And that includes RFC 1918, private space, ARIN, RIPE, AFRINIC, etc. And then you assign prefixes, and you can set them aside for certain things, certain prefixes for certain things. And then when you configure an interface in DSIM and you assign an IP address to it, then that gets put in the IPAM. And you can also set up DHCP pools and other things like that. And then all of them have both IPv4 and IPv6 support, which was not always a given with previous IPAM systems.
Yep. And then the user interface is really similar across all three. The point is, if you get comfortable with one and then you log into a different one, it's not going to look that much different. Like, you're not going to have to completely relearn how to use the user interface. It's going to be very similar. Right. So that's kind of a plus too, even though some of the underlying fundamentals are different and the companies go to markets. The fact is that you can move around pretty easily. Even in terms of automations that you write, will probably need very little tweaking moving from one platform to another, right, Barrie?
Yeah, except possibly for InfraHub. I mean, because it's built from the ground up and you are able to even customize your menu. You can customize your menus to some extent in Netbox and Nautobot. But with InfraHub, that's part of the schema. You say what you want the menu to be, and then you see that when you import the schema, you see it in the user interface. You see all the menu items that you've created, or if you just use the base schema, you see the ones that are in the base schema. But yeah. So yeah, I think you're right, though. A lot of the automations you make will be easily tweakable to fit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the noteworthy plugins and apps.
Yeah. So for Netbox, there's so many. I mean, they've been around for, I think maybe it's like a decade or more. So you've in some form or another. And so they've got like at least 31 showing on the community plugins page. And then 2 of those are official. You've got change management and branching. I used to know what change management was, and now somehow that's slipping my mind. But branching, you can create a branch, make a change to your database, and then merge the branch if everything looks good. And then they have 9 plugins that are certified by the maintainer, Netbox Labs. For example, Floor Plan, which I remember when that was created at a hackathon in Seattle, actually, by a group of users. They wanted to see a floor plan. Yeah. So they created that.
Which is different than the rack elevation is included by default, right? So you can you can establish the racks, you can say a piece of equipment's in a certain rack, and then you can show the rack position.
Yeah, this is more visualizing where they are in the data center. Yeah, where the racks are, from like a top-down view.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they have 20 other plugins on the community plugins page that are validated as compatible on either cloud or enterprise editions. And then, in addition to all of that, you can go on GitHub and find almost anything, like that somebody has written something that works with Netbox, So, there's a lot of options for Netbox just because it's been around so long. And then for Nautobot,
that would be considered an unvalidated plugin?
I
Where
guess
would
so
you
if it's not showing up on here. I don't know
where
what
would you find out about unvalidated plugins? Is there a list of those somewhere?
that I
Or
don't know. I haven't seen it on the Netbox Labs site or anything.
that might be more like you'd either figure that out on like Reddit or
Yeah.
maybe on their Discord.
Yeah, or you just get on GitHub and look for Netbox plugins, that people have written, or GitLab, or, any of those other repository servers. Yeah. And then for Nautobot, because their whole goal is to be kind of an all-in-one automation platform, they've got quite a few plugins that I rely on when I use Nautobot. For example, golden configuration, and then Nornair's kind of built in with that, but it is considered, I think there's a separate plugin for it, or there was, as of a year ago. And then jobs are kind of built in as well. And then SSOT, which I haven't ever actually used, but I think it was kind of in development when I was using it the most, when I was using Nautobot the most. And so I hadn't tried to do that, but it's actually very good for syncing something like ServiceNow, like your customer customer databases and stuff like that. You can sync that with Nautobot, with tenant data and all that kind of thing. And then if you have a customer who orders, like there's a service order or something for a new VLAN, then that would get integrated into your Nautobot data, and then you'd see on Golden Config, for example.
Might be an
that
interesting thing to just pause and talk about. There certainly are folks that will push back and say that there's never a single source of truth.
Well, yeah.
And and I think that this plugin speaks to that specifically. The name might be a little bit misleading because the idea is that we acknowledge that other systems are the source of truth for certain types of information.
Yeah.
And we want to bring those pieces of information into one place so that we have a single place that we can go that isn't the authority, but has the information from the authority for you to view.
Well, yeah, and that's what we're going to use to configure the network, right? Because we want Nautobot to be the source of truth, and so we don't want our switch configurations to be the source of truth. We don't want to have to go to all the switches to see what's actually running. You want that to be reflected in Nautobot, and so that's what golden configuration is supposed to do. But yes, in terms of single source of truth, the single source of truth plugin does have the concept of system of record, like we talked about before. So for customer information, the system of record might be, say, ServiceNow or Salesforce or something. And then, and I'm not 100% sure they support Salesforce at the moment, but yeah, you could write something to support Salesforce. If not, anyway. Aside there, but yeah, you say what the system of record is for what data, and then you pull that into Nautobot with the SSOT plugin, so that you hopefully have all the information reflected from all the actual sources of truth in your network in Nautobot, and you can see where it's not agreeing and decide what to do about it. You can decide which system you want to keep the data from.
Yep. So I just decided to pop over and have a look. We've got integrations using the single source of truth plugin with Cisco ACI, Citrix ADM, Arista Cloud Vision, Cisco DNA Center, Infoblox, IP Fabric, iTential, Libra NMS, Cisco Meraki, ServiceNow, Slurpit, SolarWinds, and vSphere. So there's quite a few options. Some of those are more data center, virtual machine, inventory oriented, and some of them are network specific, and some of them are customer level information, like ServiceNow, and some of those even have discovery tools built in for kind of collecting discovery information live from the network and then kind of making that part of the inventory. Tools like IP Fabric and Slurpit.
And the Intrepid Network Automator can write their own integration for whatever specific thing they have running that's not ServiceNow or similar. Yeah. Well, and should we move on to InfraHub? Yeah, we've got InfraHub Sync, and that's actually the tool that's meant to do all of this same kind of thing. where you have an adapter for many other sources of truth and NMS systems. That's a redundant. Yeah, anyway. So, for example, they have a Nautobot adapter, which I used during the hackathon to sync the data from the hackathon's Nautobot instance. And then there's obviously Netbox too, and then Slurpit and IP Fabric, like you had mentioned, for Nautobot as well. And then they have Emma, which is an agent that will interact with InfraHub and it will help you import things with CSV files, or it'll allow you to visualize a schema before you implement it, I believe. So, or maybe it's after you've implemented it, but it'll show it to you in a sort of graphical format instead of just the YAML file.
Yep. I forget if we'd discuss AI in here anywhere.
I don't think we
don't
did.
really have a dedicated page for that. I think before we move on, maybe we'll touch on that just briefly. So I had a chance to get a presentation from Tim Fiola over at Network to Code earlier this week, actually, with what they're calling Nautobot GPT. And Nautobot GPT, the goal is two things. So one, it is like a language model where it directly links to your inventory and you can just ask it questions in plain English.
Yeah.
That wasn't English. And it'll tell you all kinds of things about what is sitting in your inventory tool, which is pretty nice. But the use case that was also kind of interesting was the coding interface. So he showed me an example where you could feed it requirements and ask it to generate code for a job. And the way that they've made this a bit unique compared to just going to ChatGPT or Anthropic is that and having Claude generated is that it actually, they've instilled, somehow they've trained it on the best practices for developing plugins. How they like to see, not plugins, but jobs, how they like to see a job written and before it's plugged into the system. And then it gives you little notes on, once you've taken this code, then you install it into this directory and then you blah, blah, blah. It gives you all the steps to actually implement the job.
That's great. Yeah.
So I think that as a first step, I think that's kind of interesting for a source of truth system. It's not the end all be all, but you got to start somewhere and then get some customer feedback.
Yeah.
I do think there's some value in having an LLM that does code generation that does actually know something about the environment that you're asking it to code for. That should, in theory, I don't know if this is the case in practice, but in theory, it should reduce the error rate of stuff that just doesn't work the first time. So that's good. And then Netbox is just taking a completely different approach to AI. They're doing an MCP server.
Yeah, I believe InfraHub is as well. I saw them discussing it in the last day or so, even on the Discord server. They didn't have anything that they were going to implement natively for an agent, but they have the MCP server that they're working on. So yeah.
And I don't believe it's that hard to build an MCP. I haven't done it myself. I don't think it's that hard, though, if you already have an API to then have an MCP sit in front of the API and do things. All interesting stuff. Everybody's got their own little take on what the best or easiest way to help people solve problems is, but none of these platforms are behind the eight ball in terms of being AI ready or AI capable, I guess I should say.
Yeah, and I saw that Tiago has posted something in the chat. Who should be the source of reliable information? Does the network equipment update the system, or does the system update the network equipment? In the case of IP networks, it is possible to automate some things between them. Yeah, we're going to talk about or we kind of did a little bit here. We talked about golden configuration in Nautobot. And I think, with that's a kind of a philosophical question. I think if you ask a lot of people that are really into automation, they want the system to update the network to reduce errors. But, you got it to present.
A
But I
feature I
think,
only just noticed just now.
yeah, that's funny. But, so I guess that's definitely a philosophical question, but I think that's the intent-based networking philosophy, right? That you want to put your intent somewhere in like a source of truth, and then that source of truth is the source, of what the configuration data should be in the network. So then you push that to the network equipment. That's why you hear people talking about pushing configurations all the time, because you want to push from your reliable source of truth. But if you have an unreliable source of truth, you're in a brownfield network, you are only partially reconciled, then yeah, you can do what Tiago mentioned, which is automate some things kind of between them. And what that means is you discover from the network, and then you decide which is going to be the correct thing, and then you put that in your source of truth. So that can take a lot of
I
time.
think where people
Yeah.
get hung up is, so they deploy the source of truth system and they want it to be the source of truth, but by default it doesn't have a plugin where, like, if you go in and you set an interface description, you can then just click a button and say, please go change the network accordingly. Right? That's something you have to write and add to
Yeah, you have
do
to write a
that
job.
config push out to the network. And
Specifically, if it's piecemeal like that, you have to
right,
write that yourself. That's not part of the intended, way of automating for some of these platforms, right?
right. You would instead maybe write a tool that collects information from all the customer systems and or other systems and figures out, okay, well, based on all the information I've collected, this is what the interface description should say. And then it writes that into Nautobot, and then that gets pushed out to the network. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But automation's a journey,
Yeah, for sure.
right? It's not a destination that you can just arrive at quickly.
No, and it takes a lot of work. I think that a lot of people are kind of like, well, if I install Nautobot, it's got jobs and it's got golden config, and then I'm not going to need to spend any more time on this. But it does still take a lot of work to
Yeah,
get it working how you want it to, and then to make the decisions on, like, well, I see that these systems are out of sync now. How do I get it in sync?
that's right.
Yeah, it's an
I think
ongoing problem.
I think Greg Freeman, if he's still on the webinar,
Mm-hmm.
a great example of the journey that it takes to get there. The company and the network that he works on, they're not fully automated yet. They've
Yeah,
been working at it for 5 years.
yeah, it's not
I
surprising.
think last note they're at like 90+% of everything automated, which is outstanding.
That's fantastic. Yeah,
I can't even remember the number of, I mean, like tens of millions of automations that represents on their network, since it's
yeah,
so huge. I mean, it's a massive number, but you don't get there all at once. So when you're thinking about how do I deploy this and how do I start to get value out of it, I don't think that having the network be the source of truth and writing into Nautobot, I don't think that's a wrong answer.
yeah,
But at some point, you'll get to the point, and you'll know what that is. You get to a certain pain point where you're like, I have to go and change this in the network first, and then I have to wait for the job to run the update Nautobot because there's something else I want to do.
yep,
Like, you'll know when you outgrow that, and then it's time to change the approach and maybe have Nautobot or Netbox or InfraHub become the source of truth for the network, and have the network then get its information from that tool.
yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and well, we have a plan to discuss that a few slides from now. Maybe we should
Let's move on.
let's talk about the ideal use cases first, though. And they are all three very similar, but they do have some differences that would make it. Oh, somebody's gotten. Oh, I didn't see that comment come in. Do we want to talk about that? SSOT is difficult when you don't have a single source of change. For example, service delivery makes customer config changes with their SSOT, and then the ops eng teams have their golden config. The balance is how to have multiple teams changing the network but keeping it to a standard. That is very difficult. I've gone to a few of the AutoCon conferences, and that is a recurring theme. Everybody's talking about you got to get buy-in from the organization. If you try to start automating before you have buy-in from either higher up or across all the teams, you're going to run into unique challenges from that, because like you said, people are going to change something over here, and then that's going to affect things over here. It's going to be out of sync, and you end up kind of undoing each other's work. So that is a difficult balance. You're right, Mike. I think you have to at some point decide what the standard is for the company, and everybody has to agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Buy-in is key.
Ideal use cases.
Yeah, ideal use cases. Yeah. So for Netbox, that's really well established. So many people have Netbox implemented already. If you already have it working, and it's working well, why would you even think of changing what you have? You've got your automations, everything's running smoothly. Definitely stick with it. Also, a reason to start with Netbox might be there is a huge pool of expertise and knowledge to draw from in the industry. It's already established, it's stable, maintenance and development is ongoing. It doesn't seem like Netbox Labs is going anywhere. So, development will probably continue, and maintenance. So, that's definitely a big win for Netbox, is that it's very stable. And that's what they're trying to do. They want to be the best documentation platform for the network source of truth. And, I kind of tongue in cheek on all of these, we say, you are willing to dedicate time and energy to automation. And basically I have that as the last sentence for all three of them. You will notice that. But no matter what you do, automation takes time. When you get it kind of working and you get it into maintenance mode, though, that's when you tend to see the benefits. You can grow without adding a commensurate number or, equivalent number of people. And that's the end goal for most networks, I think. So yeah, anyway, with Nautobot, maybe you take a new job and they don't have anything, but you've worked on Netbox before, and you have like a new use case now, but you don't want to have to develop all those integrations you spent years doing, and you don't want to have to do that all over again. You want a platform that's already set up to do the automation that you want to do. You have it in your head. This Nautobot might be a good use case. That might be a good use case for Nautobot then, because they do have, golden config built in. There's network onboarding that is, I think it's gotten to a much more mature point than it was maybe even a year ago, so that they've spent a lot of time working on the onboarding. They used to have a kind of a network onboarding app before that wasn't really officially supported, and now they've put a lot of work into an official app for that. And it is pretty mature now as well. It's been since 2021, I think, that it was forked, and a lot of the growing pains they've gotten through, and it works pretty well now. I mean, these all work really well in the grand scheme of things, but there are lots of gotchas, I think, when you start digging into your specific use case, something a little custom. There's always going to be something, but with both Netbox and Nautobot, a lot of that has been ironed out. So they're pretty mature. And then you're still willing to dedicate resources to automation. You're still going to have to do something, I think.
To be clear, you don't have to automate anything to get a lot of value out of these tools.
That is true. We talked about that yesterday. That's true. I kind of am coming into this with, of course we want to automate. But yeah, you can use these for...
you want to automate.
Yeah.
Automation is the whole point.
Yep. Yeah.
And certainly when we pick a tool, we want to know that it's going to help support the mission of automation. All three of these tools are great for that.
But if you're just going to document the network, that's a laudable goal in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
And then you will be better positioned for automation in the future. These are all great. use cases, just documenting the network as well.
Yeah. And sometimes the line blurs as well. And I'll raise an example. So with Nautobot and the golden config is the reason a lot of people choose Nautobot.
Yes.
It's unique to Nautobot as far as a plugin capability. Netbox and InfraHub do not have that. I don't believe InfraHub has a golden config type of plugin. And granted, you can do that in another system if you want, but a lot of people choose Nautobot specifically to get that. But guess what? If you want to, in order to validate configurations across your whole network, across all different types of devices, you have to write templating. And the templating to do the validation is exactly the same templating you would use for automation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it can be. You can use Jinja config to go and push configs. You use Jinja to write the templates that validate, does this config meet my standard? And so, just by doing the golden config piece, you kind of have to make some very serious steps towards being able to fully automate your network.
Templating is a huge amount of the work. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's probably the bulk of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But once you get that done, now you're in an even better position to be able to automate from your new source of truth platform, because you've learned everything that you need to build the configuration and the standards. So
it's just another step to then push it, right? Do the config remediation, as Nautobot calls it. And then for InfraHub, of course, the ideal use case is you are on the cutting edge, right? You need a custom model. You have like a transport network, your example, Dave, that requires a new or completely different schema. You don't mind experimenting, or you want to try something new. And then, of course, there's artifacts that will speed up your provisioning. So if you have all this installed, but then it's taking, 15, 20 minutes to generate like a JSON file every time you want to push your configs to the network, you want to cut that down, the artifacts will help with that because they're stored with the data. You don't have to generate them every time. And an artifact, by the way, if people are wondering, is just like a config or a config snippet even that's stored with the data that creates it from the template. So you run the template kind of offline then, basically. You render it, and then the config is generated, and then it gets stored with the data. So like the IP address config for your interface, And then, maybe a lot of people are talking about network CI/CD, just like software CI/CD. And so if you want to implement that, InfraHub's probably the ideal platform for that. Although the others do have version control and branching now in some form or another. And then, of course, you also must be willing to dedicate staff time to automation. So,
Barrie, you're like a broken record.
I know. Yeah, it takes time. That's the point I want everybody to come away with. No, that's not the only point. But I don't want people to think, oh, this is going to solve all my problems immediately. None of these do. It requires work, but they will set you up for much more success.
Nothing in life is ever easy, but there are varying levels of efficiency.
For some reason, I'm always surprised by how much time it takes me to do what I think, I know how to do that. That's going to be simple. And then, yeah. So
let's take a look at the decision matrix. We've tried our best to distill down the most important pieces of information that you're going to want to either a reference that you'll want to go look at as part of your decision-making process, or just some high-level check the box kind of stuff. So Netbox, Nautobot, InfraHub, the maintainers' websites are there. I want to take this chance to just give a shout out to the maintainers of all these platforms. Thank you so much for building these products and making them available to the community for free.
Yeah.
That really helps drive adoption. It helps a bunch of networks do things better that they otherwise wouldn't be doing. So thank you, Netbox Labs. Thank you, Network to Code. And thank you, OpsMill, for taking this business model to bring these products to market. That's really helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, we wouldn't have anything to do without them. So, yeah. And then I just want to point out the demo sandbox there that's kind of in the middle. For each of these, they have a demo instance running. And not only that, they have a repository with all of the files and, configuration, YAML files, etc., that go into what's going on in each of these sandboxes. So that is an invaluable source of information if you're stuck on, how do I write a schema file or something? There's a schema in use for the demo for InfraHub. Same thing, like, how do I write a job that works for what I want to do? Well, they have a whole bunch of them running on the Nautobot demo. Same thing with Netbox. I haven't dug into that one as much, but I know that there's a lot of the same kind of thing going on there. So if you're struggling with how to do something in any of these three, I would go first to the demo and also the demo repo to see how things are configured in the demo.
Cool. So we've got the repository listed here. So you can, there's great, in addition to the website, there's also documentation on GitHub itself that you can use to review. And in fact, a lot of these websites just link to the GitHub documentation as well. So, but that's a good resource for you. They all have chat servers and communities.
Mm-hmm.
Looks to me like the Ops Mill one is still kind of getting its foundation, building some critical mass, but the Network to Code Slack has got a ton of people on it. And it's not even just Nautobot related. They have a whole bunch of other adjacent categories on there. So great community.
They still have a Netbox channel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and Juniper, Arista. Sorry, Dave. I was going to say about the InfraHub Discord, though, when I did this, it was only about 300. I haven't looked lately. They actually, on all three of these, a lot of the developers are there. So that's the main benefit of posting on these. It's not so much that there's, 35,000 members or only 300. It's more that you get the developers' attention. So it's a good place to post.
Cloud instances. So what is a cloud instance, Barrie?
So that's if you want to spin up a working Nautobot or Netbox that's it's already ready for you to use. You don't have to do any of the, Docker configuration or create an instance of a VM to do a straight Linux installation or any of that. It's already running. You just click and it spins up and you have your empty Netbox or Nautobot. InfraHub, I believe, is working on doing the same sort of thing. So that's why it says coming soon.
Well, I hate containers. I hate working with containers. I still do not enjoy containers.
I would say they have all made this much easier than it used to be. If you want to do Docker,
it is a little easier. It is a little easier, but it's still, it's still be.
Well, you hate Kubernetes too, right?
I do. I'm not a Kubernetes fan. Sorry, Tony.
But the idea here with Kubernetes, for example, is that it automates the spinning up of the containers for you. So you don't even have to do the Docker Compose stuff, assuming you get it working. And then, but that's what I know you don't like doing.
So the interesting thing here, so you can get up and running really quickly if you just spin it up in the cloud. But it isn't really just spinning it up in the cloud. You typically have to negotiate a contract for that. And the pricing is based on how many devices you're going to have and all those kinds of things. So, but it is it's a SaaS model, software as a service. You will buy the service and then it will be maintained for you. They'll do upgrades for you. They'll handle all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you don't have to do the Kubernetes yourself, Dave.
That's right. That's a huge plus. But then what I do have to do in order for the automation is I have to have a linkage. I have to have like an API gateway or some other way for that tool to actually get into my network in a secure way. And I have to trust this whole environment. Now I have this thing sitting out in the cloud that, if somebody hacks into that, they can completely destroy my entire network. That might be a little scary for some people. Certainly your security department is going to want to vet that very carefully.
Yeah.
So, alternative to that, the nice thing about the open source model is if you have a very strict security posture, you can deploy that inside your own network. There's no outside ties. So anybody who's not on the VPN, for example, can't get to that and you're secure at that point.
Yeah, I think a lot of smaller companies that I've worked with have just opted to do a Linux install on either a standalone server that they have, or they have like Proxmox and they can just create a VM and run it on there. But the Docker Compose is actually really nice because you can even just run it on your laptop. And just for playing around with it, you could use Docker Compose for all three of these and then import some data and then just see how it works with each one of these and use that to decide, like inform how you want to do this. And then go and do either a Linux install, Docker Compose, or Kubernetes in your production environment. Yeah.
All right. So Docker Compose support all three, Kubernetes all three, version control. These answers look like kind of all three.
They are. With Netbox and Nautobot, it's not native, I believe. So Nautobot requires the version control app, and it does it a little differently. It uses a DOLT database to kind of stage the changes, as I understand it. I haven't tried it, and then once you approve it, it'll move that data somehow. I don't know how it works into the SQL database.
This is a feature I haven't actually played with yet, Barry.
Yeah, me neither.
Humor me for a minute for the curveball question. So, let's take an example. Let's say that I have to do a huge infrastructure upgrade in a site. I'm going to add a couple devices, and in the process, I'm going to have to take some interfaces that are currently in use for some things, allocate them for another purpose. Does this let me build like a future version of what my network is going to look like and kind of have that modeled, but not have it be, the model, the version of record, so to speak, until that maintenance window when I merge those changes in? Is that how I can use it?
I think so. I think, yeah, it has it's kind of, as far as I understand it, it's intertwined with their approvals kind of feature. And so you propose the change. It's in the DOLT database, DOLT or do it, I don't know. And then, I don't know if that's an L or a capital I, but and then once it's approved, then it can get merged into the Postgres or MySQL database. Whereas for Netbox, I believe they actually, in PostgreSQL, create a whole other copy of the entire database, and that's the branch. And then when you decide it's time to merge it, it gets merged into the actual working database. So I think that's the difference.
We tried to do that, something like that at Global Crossing. Well, we did actually do that. We built a tool called PM Tool, and also we had this network documentation tool called NetViz. And this guy named James Conway and Chris Espy were both instrumental in bringing that around. But that was kind of the same thing, which is, sometimes things move so quickly that you're actually in multiple versions before you can get things implemented.
Yeah.
So you could be like on version 3 of your San Jose 1 POP, but you've already had to make a version 4, a version 5, a version 6, a version 7 because things have been growing so. And then you have equipment delivery timeframes where you're trying to like balance, like, okay, well, at what point in time can I do this other upgrade? So that's really cool that they have that. That's very useful capability.
I can tell you what else it helps with. It's back in 2.4, in that old 2.4 version of Netbox I was using a few years ago. I actually deleted an entire switch accidentally.
Oops.
And you have to rebuild the switch, at least back then. You had to rebuild the entire model from hand. The template was there for how a particular switch is supposed to be. Yeah.
So the version control is basically an undo button for mistakes.
Yeah, I think so. I think that copy of the database gets merged in, but I'm not sure what happens with, like what was there before, but I think you can roll back to it. So that would be really helpful in that case.
That's really handy.
I haven't used it though.
I don't ever make mistakes, so I don't need an undo version.
Of course not. Of course not. Oh, somebody's got an AI question. When Tony said high availability is the keyword, I think that was when we were talking about Kubernetes. Yeah. So Greg says
sorry, Tony, wasn't watching the chat.
Yes, sorry guys.
Is it fair to say Nautobot is the easiest? I have to repost that.
No, go ahead.
Is it fair to say Nautobot is the easiest generative AI capability within Nautobot GPT today, and the others is build your own via MCP? I think so.
Yeah, I think so, but that's not. It's in beta, right, Dave? Nautobot GPT?
Yes, and I think and at least today it also requires that you are buying the cloud version of Nautobot,
Okay.
which is another limitation. So
Yeah.
if you have a locally deployed Nautobot instance, you're out of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is because, what they've done is they've taken their own LLM,
Mm-hmm.
and they've deployed it into their cloud, and then it gets linked to your instance of Nautobot so that it actually knows, when you ask it a question, it's referring to your specific data to retrieve that. I don't. I think it's too early to say whether that's a strength or a weakness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Tim did say that they are planning on being able to let you deploy that locally for your own locally installed instance of Nautobot. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
The other two are taking the MCP approach, which also has pros and cons. I think it has some big benefits in terms of speed to market. To say that you have an AI interface, you can tie it in with Claude or ChatGPT, but on the downside, it's tied in with cloud versions of Claude and ChatGPT.
Unless you have your
So
own local LLM, right?
yeah, I think privacy is on everyone's mind,
Yeah.
and your
Hence the
inventory
local.
system,
Yeah.
your inventory system by nature is going to have tons of PII, personally
Exactly.
identifiable information in it, tons of confidential network information that you do not want to get out.
Mm-mm.
It gets in the hands of hackers or data thieves
Yeah.
or whatever. There's all kinds of bad things that can be done with that. So
Big concern.
everyone should not dive in head first into AI. They should ask themselves some of these questions before they get started.
Even if you're pasting a bunch of stuff into a public LLM, that there's, you could be putting PII in there if you're not careful. So, yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of like the databases they each use, we touched on this before. Netbox and Nautobot use SQL. Nautobot has the option for MySQL. Otherwise, they both support Postgres natively. And then InfraHub uses Neo4j, which is a graph database. So it's not as structured as an SQL database. So that
Which
gives
is an
more
inherent part of
flexibility.
what makes it so flexible
Yeah,
in
exactly.
terms of the data models, is that
Yes,
you can literally make a mess out of your data.
you can. And but you can also change the schema on the fly. And then that's why branching is really important, right? Because before you change your schema, you want to create a branch in case it destroys everything. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, and then they all have REST and GraphQL APIs. InfraHubs is structured slightly differently because of the graph database and some of the other ways they implement the GraphQL and the REST. But yeah, it's if you know how to use the others, you'll get there, and they're providing more examples. Every time somebody asks a question in the Discord, we get a whole nother treasure trove of examples on how to do stuff. So it's changing quickly and it's maturing quickly. That's good, but they all will give you that API, endpoint for interacting with the data in a programmatic fashion. And they all support Ansible and Nornir, a dynamic inventory. And by dynamic inventory, most people are familiar with how in Ansible and Nornir you can create an inventory YAML file, but then that's static and you have to go in and edit the YAML file if you want to change anything. So it's really helpful to use Ansible and Nornir with the option for a dynamic inventory, which is essentially kind of an API interaction with Nornir and Ansible, so that if you change something in your source of truth, then when you go and push things to Ansible with Ansible or Nornir to your devices, then you're getting the updated inventory. All right, let's see what do we have here? Yes, extensibility. So this is like the plugins and the apps. Netbox calls them plugins. Nautobot calls them apps. They both have them. Like we were talking about, Netbox is mainly community generated, although there's a couple of official ones now. And certified ones. And then Nautobot has a lot of maintained apps that are kind of part of their automation platform offering, and both have custom fields and relationships. And then InfraHub kind of takes a different tack. They have that schema flexibility we've talked about, and then they have sync adapters. And that's kind of for bringing in your data or exporting your data, depending on the situation. And then that kind of ties into the next one, network sync and onboarding. InfraHub sync is kind of for that as well. But it's more for, rather than device configs at this point, I think they might be working on that. At this point, it's more for other SOTs or third-party tools like Slurpit and IP Fabric, as you can see on the next couple of lines. And then for Netbox and Nautobot, let's see, Netbox has third-party plugins as far as I can tell. I haven't tried to onboard a network with Netbox recently, or I don't think I've ever actually tried to do that. Back in the day, we put everything in with templates when I used that 2.4 version. Nautobot has the onboarding app and then golden config for syncing. So you can check your config backups against your Nautobot data generated by templates. And then, of course, the SSOT app, which we talked about earlier as well.
Yeah. Well, the onboarding app in Nautobot is not that useful. All it does is really go and collect some basic information from the device, like the serial number and I think the code version and stuff.
Have you used it lately, though? Because it's quite a bit different. I used it a few months ago, and it actually is the intention is to go and get all the information from the switch now. Okay. So you've got one part of it that does the serial number and just brings it in. And then now you've got a whole other part of, I don't even know what you would call it, like a whole other framework for going. And once you've done that, you got the serial number and the most basic information in Nautobot. There is a whole nother, it uses text FSM templates, I think, to go out, ask the switch for information, like Juniper will output JSON, and then that will get imported into Nautobot.
Basically what they used to have is this separate tool called Network Import that you would use to import things.
This is different. This is all new.
This is a native thing that's built into Nautobot, and Netbox has released that as well. It's something that I saw when we did a workshop at AutoCon in November last year, where Slurpit was showing us their network ingest tool, and it was really cool that it had it had not version control, reconciliation, so you could run the plugin and it could say, oh, guess what, your source of truth is out of sync with the network, and you could review the changes and integrate them, which is very nice. And now Netbox has that natively.
It does. Okay. So yeah, that's new then to me. And then, yeah, like Slurpit is another vendor, right? And similar to IP Fabric. And so they have that. And then there's all these other integrations, which we couldn't put it all on here. There's so many. But a lot of them, they have adapters for InfraHub and then the integrations for Netbox and Nautobot as well. I guess they're plugins, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then, so for InfraHub, I think I haven't found a way. And I wonder if any of the people from OpsMill are on here today. I don't think so. But I know that it's possible to write your own particularly if you can get JSON from the device, like Juniper easily outputs JSON. Arista does. I think Cisco, some versions of Cisco, maybe NXOS, have that option. Then you could write your own adapter pretty easily if you are intrepid, though.
Yep.
And then Libre NMS is another one that was kind of I thought that was interesting, so we added that on here. Yep. That you can sync from Libre
brand
NMS.
New for a lot of these guys, but certainly we all love Libre NMS, particularly for smaller network installations, just because it's so bloody easy to stand up.
Yep.
And it's free, and it's actually like a lot easier to use than, say, SolarWinds.
I think a lot of smaller companies have, I mean, most of them will have Libre NMS instances, right?
It's just too easy not to have it. Well, let's, that wraps it up for the decision matrix. Last thing, we have a few notes on how to get started with one of these tools. And so there's maybe some slightly different things slightly different ways to think about things if you're doing a greenfield deployment versus brownfield. Brownfield, of course, meaning you already have a network and some stuff out there, maybe even an existing source of truth tool as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like for a greenfield, it's obviously a lot easier because you decide how you're going to do this. You don't have to contend with the reality of what's in your network. So, you come up with your network design, right, before you even start deploying things. So, you can model that in your source of truth. And then you can hopefully get your business systems integrated easily. Maybe you pick a business system like ServiceNow or something because there's an existing integration for it, like for Nautobot's SSOT plugin or something or app. And you have the ability to be flexible when you're just getting started with a Greenfield network. But yeah, then the idea is you generate and you push your configs to your devices rather than configuring them manually and then having to deal with getting that in the source of truth. So that when you do have business updates, like you're putting out a new pod in another city, or you have a new customer coming on who needs circuits configured and interfaces, when you get all that in your source of truth, then you just push a button, config goes out to the devices, and it's configured. And then you can disable CLI for most users, which is like the holy grail for people trying to automate. You want to keep the everyday users from configuring things against the standard manually on the devices on the fly and then forgetting about it, So, yeah.
Yep. So brownfield's always where it gets more complicated because we almost always, I mean, it's pretty rare to find yourself in a situation where you're greenfield. Almost always you come into a situation and there's always legacy stuff that you have to deal with. Data import is going to cause you to ask some important questions. Like if there is an existing source of truth, do I trust it?
Yeah.
Because if you don't trust it, then do you want to actually copy the information over? Maybe you do. Maybe it's got enough enriched data in there already that you pretty much have to start with it.
Yeah.
And then maybe use a discovery process to try and reconcile any differences that the database might see in your new tool. But the migration process is pretty easy. We've done it both ways, right? Right, Barry? We exported CSV tables from an old version of one platform and then imported them into the latest version of a different platform. So we went from Netbox to Nautobot once.
Yeah.
But also there were some things that just didn't work well with the CSV import process. And you and Chris Grundeman both wrote some APIs to go and retrieve information and then handle it in a specific way and write it into the new database. And I think depending on the situation, those both work great.
Yeah, and then we helped the engineers figure out how to do that themselves when they had more data they wanted to put in. How to interact with the API and programmatically update Nautobot with that information. And then I guess, you want to, after you've got the data in, you want to develop your standard designs for your automated config generation. And yet, to the next point, you're going to have those legacy configs and you have to figure out, like, what am I going to do to deal with that, right? So there's a couple of, there's a few different options. You can just cap and grow, meaning you stop those legacy configs, you leave them as they are, but when you grow, you go with the standard. Or you can rip it all out and replace it, or you can try to identify where there's discrepancies and remediate that. So there's, you have to decide what's going to be the best use of your time and get you the most clean data. So, and then you want to integrate with your business systems as in the Greenfield. Eventually you want to do that. And you want to get backups automated and that kind of thing. And then get to the point where you can generate and push those configs. Now, the question also is, as we talked about this a little before, do you want to replace existing configs, or do you just want to do partials? Like, I just want to change NTP for now. Just want to get my NTP working correctly, and that requires a little bit of coding, but it can be done. And then, you want to like you pointed out, you want to build the foundation for your journey to low or no CLI, but that doesn't happen overnight. So when you get your network documented correctly, you've got your Jinja templates, and maybe you've standardized some of the stuff like NTP and everything. You're building your foundation, but it takes a while. It is a journey, but
I mean, it could
eventually
be
that's the
forever.
goal.
Could be
Yeah, it could be.
forever. You may never get to know CLI, but we definitely don't want to. We don't want to be there. We don't want to be in the CLI all the time.
No,
That's a
but
recipe for human error.
exactly. But getting the data into like something like a source of truth or somewhere that's reliable is often the first step. Yeah. So, and then you've got a lot of stuff you need to do, but it can be done, and you just have to do what you can at every moment and work towards it and try to get buy-in, as we discussed before. And eventually you can get there, maybe.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well, that pretty much wraps it up for today. Unless there are any other questions that people want to ask, or comments are welcome too, or corrections are also welcome.
Yeah, we don't
There are,
know everything.
these, I mean, it is pretty impressive. These platforms they're all moving really quickly in terms of new development. It's very exciting to see all the new stuff that they're coming out with.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to keep up with even the improvements to the platforms you're actively supporting for clients, let alone keep track of what the other platforms are doing and compare and contrast, and then get a chance to test them. It's that'd be a full-time job for a couple of people, I think. But we certainly welcome input from anybody that has corrections to make. Let us know about new things that have come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, maybe the next one of these, Barry, we should do more like a roundtable where we just have a Zoom call, everybody come in and have kind of a seat at the table to share their own thoughts. But your final closing thoughts, if you are looking to deploy one of these and you need some help, NetMavens is here to give you a hand. So
Mm-hmm.
reach out.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
And
doesn't look like we have any other questions on the webinar. So I will also take the time to thank you, Barry, for joining.
thank
Thank you for
thank you.
sharing your expertise with and everybody else on the webinar, and the future people who watch this on YouTube.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dave. It was a great conversation.
Thanks. Everyone
All right.
have an awesome day, and
Yeah.
hopefully I'll see you next time.
Thank you.